Hello and welcome from the First United Methodist Church in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. I'm in the narthex at the back of the sanctuary, and here I stand with a painting of Martin Luther, one of several watercolors that were drawn by Jack Schenkel for the back of the church, and that represent many people whose witness has been a strong part of the development of Christianity in this part of the world. Martin Luther, of course, was never in this part of the world. He was a man who lived in Germany at the beginning of the 1500s, at a time when the printing press had just been invented and had just begun to let its influence be known. Martin Luther was a monk who loved the church and saw that there were a lot of ways in which it could be better and offered his suggestions, as many people were doing at that time. He wrote up a list of 95 points that he was willing to argue about, where there were things that the church, he thought, needed to be redirected or, shall we say, reformed about. That's why once his points that he said could be very good and very helpful were found by a printer, they were disseminated throughout Europe very quickly because of that printing press, and in a way that would not have happened even 20 years before. It set off a widespread movement called the Reformation, the Reformation. It was not the first time something like that had happened. It isn't the last, but it's the one we give the name, the Reformation. One of the central points that he wanted to make was that he felt that we had forgotten as a church that everything that we experience, every privilege that we have as God's children, every blessing comes from the fact that God loves us, not that we are especially great. I mean, we are sinners. We mess up. We are, at the core of our being, messed up people. But that doesn't stop God's love. And it isn't because of anything that we do. It isn't because of any group we're a part of. It isn't because of anything other than God's grace, pure and simple, given to us freely, that we are able to make anything of our lives, or that God is able to make anything of us. But we can make something of our lives because God makes something of us. And out of the give and take and all the political machinations that were involved in trying to bring change about and all of that, Martin Luther and many people like him were able to bring renewal. And not only in the people that broke off, quote unquote, but also in the people that were still there, quote unquote. I think we finally reached a point 500 years later where Protestants and Catholics are willing to recognize each other as Christians, although there are still differences. But we need to appreciate and be grateful for the gift of the reformers who taught us so very much and led us to keep on looking at ourselves, not in light of ourselves, but in the light of God's gift of salvation. through faith in Christ. So, with that in mind, let's start our worship today with a hymn that he wrote. A mighty fortress is our God. Hear these words from Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 to 46. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them this question. What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he? They said to him, the son of David. He said to them, how is it then that David, by the Spirit, calls him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. If David thus calls him Lord, how can he be his son? No one was able to give him an answer, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. As I said in the introduction back in the narthex, the great theological proclamation of the Protestant Reformation is that we are saved by grace. Grace alone. God's grace. God's love given to us. Active through our faith in Jesus. We're not saved by participation in any particular religious ritual. We are not saved by our alignment with the doctrines of any particular theological viewpoint. We are not saved by our good works. And all of those things are important. And all of those things matter. But none of them come up to anything when it's stacked against God's grace. That is the one thing that we count on. It's simply God's good and perfect love for each and every one of us that draws us into relationship with himself. It's a love that changes and transforms us, both as individuals and as a people. It's something that draws forth our love for God in return and leads us to love others as we have first been loved by God. The whole process of the universe begins with God. The whole existence of everything is for God, and we play a part in it by God's grace. He gives us a chance to be, and then gives us a chance to know Him. In the Gospel of Matthew, we read this incident where a lawyer asked Jesus a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment is the greatest? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. It begins with God's love. It works by God's love. It works to share God's love. The heart of the good news is not law. The heart of the good news is love. And yet, there's this pesky thing called sin. We know that law is needed because God's love is not perfected yet in us. As Wesleyans, we insist it's possible, but it's God working in us that perfects God's love. It's not something that comes from ourselves. Martin Luther's expression for it was to say that we are simul justus et peccator, at once, simultaneously, a just person and a sinner. Sin is real. Sin is pervasive. And we need law to keep it in line, to keep us in line. Primarily, we're speaking of the religious and the moral law, the things that we read about and things we learn about in the Ten Commandments. But not all law, even the laws we live by in a given society, are always written down. Sometimes there are things that we treat as law, accepted procedures, accepted normal ways of doing things, norms, we say for short. The way we do things that keeps things moving and allow us to live together. Even good manners, please and thank you, are so basic to our lives if we expect to be around other people. And they're not legally mandated. I don't know how you could even think of that, but what would the world be without them? Or imagine what would happen if a group like, say Congress, stopped listening to each other, stopped doing things as they long have agreed to do them, and refused even to consider finding common ground. What do you think would happen then? Just hypothetically. Or in any other group. What if an entire society decided to go off in that direction and say, my way or the highway? There have to be guidelines, at the very least. Yes, there need to be guidelines. And part of those guidelines needs to be to say you don't always get your own way, that you need to consider other people, and you need to consider God. The greatest of the law: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And a second is like it: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Without love of God, without love of neighbor, everything falls apart. Even faith can be threatened when love is not shown, when grace is not shown to one another, even as God extends grace to us. And here I have a kind of a long story, but I think it illustrates it. So bear with me. One outcome of the Protestant Reformation, the Reformation of the 1500s, was the renewal of congregational singing as part of worship. A good proportion of the tunes that we sing go back to that time. Some of them, like the one I played earlier while you stared at the picture of Martin Luther, was one of his. A mighty fortress is our God. So possibly, it's attributed to him sometimes, so possibly is Away in a Manger. But the Calvinist branch of the Reformation that was strongest in France and in Switzerland and in Scotland, they put an emphasis not on writing and singing that kind of a hymn. They emphasized that there were already hymns that were in the scriptures and that we should concentrate on those, the Psalms. But they didn't go so far as to say, okay, we should sing them exactly as they are in Hebrew. It was okay to translate them into French or German or Scots. And it was okay to have music. So you're going to have to fit them into the beat. And so there emerged what is called the metrical psalm. Now, the Psalms were a familiar part of worship in medieval Europe, but up to the time of the Reformation, they were generally chanted in Latin, either by the clergy or every single day by the monks and by the nuns. And they were chanted in the language that the scriptures were being read in, Latin. And with a very few exception, the tunes were not exactly catchy. Then these reformers came along and said, wait a minute, listen to this, and presented people with these metrical psalms instead in their own language. All people that on earth do dwell, sing to the Lord with cheerful voice. Him serve with mirth, his praise forth tell. Come ye before him and rejoice. That's the setting of Psalm 100. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come into God's presence with singing. And we still sing that tune to those words. The tune, because it was from the 100th Psalm, it was written to sing the 100th Psalm, uh, is called Old Hundredth. We still sing the doxology to it, but we still sing the 100th Psalm to it. And the followers of John Calvin, the ones that especially leaned hard on these metrical psalms, they went so far as to say that, these, if you get it right, just stick to these. These are the ones you should use. Don't mess around with importing other things into the worship. Use this, God's own word. So Old Hundredth, the music specifically, was written by a Frenchman named Louis Bourgeois, who had become a Protestant. And like many French Protestants, had to go into exile and had to leave France because of his faith. And like many of them, he settled in the French speaking area of what is now Switzerland, around Geneva. Because in Geneva, John Calvin was busy trying to create an ideal community, one that would live according to biblical precepts. And it had mixed success. At one point, they kicked Calvin out. They said, "Come on, get lost. This isn't going to work. You're too much of a killjoy." Uh, but then there was a lot of chaos, and they called him back. They said, "Yeah, we do need somebody to control things, and you seem to be able to do it." Um, so there he was, put it that way. And in 1547, Louis Bourgeois, had published his first book of metrical psalms for congregational singing. And then I read in 1551, things got a little difficult for him. According to one biography, the one you'll find in Wikipedia, he fell foul of local musical authorities. And I just want to stop there and say, I have fun just trying to picture what these musical authorities must have been like. Very straight laced men in black with big white collars looking down and saying, "We will have none of this." And at the same time, they're in charge of the music. If you've ever seen the movie Footloose, anyway, I won't go there. He fell foul of local musical authorities and was sent to prison on the 3rd of December, 1551, for changing the tunes for some well-known psalms, quote, "without a license," unquote. I'm Again, my mind goes off. I imagine somebody applying for a musical license, uh, showing up and instead of getting his picture taken like at the motor vehicles around here, PennDOT, he's got somebody sketching out a little picture of him and then making up a musical license, a license to compose. Uh, no, that's not what he means. But that's where my head went, and I'm getting off topic. Wikipedia continues. He was released on the personal intervention of John Calvin, but the controversy continued. Those who had already learned the tunes had no desire to learn new versions, and the town council ordered the burning of Bourgeois' instructions to the singers, claiming they were confusing. Shortly after this, Bourgeois left Geneva never to return. He settled in Lyon. His Geneva employment was terminated, and his wife tardily followed him to Lyon. While in Lyon, Bourgeois wrote a fierce piece of invective against the publishers in Geneva. His daughter was baptized in Paris in May 1560 as a Catholic. And also in 1560, a Parisian publisher posthumously printed a volume of his secular songs, chansons in French, a form he had condemned as dissolute during his Geneva years. What I get is a picture of somebody who just had such a horrible experience in Geneva and ran into people who had so little grace in their own hearts, so little joy in their own lives, so little peace that they just made everybody miserable for the sake of getting every last thing right. People who had a sense of law, but not really a good sense of grace. And that happened even among the reformers. Over and over again, I'm sad to say, but I mean, really, how much good music that Bourgeois could have produced for the church was lost because of those local musical authorities? And what kind of mindset is it on behalf of the town council that they don't just set aside music they don't like and say, don't bother with this, but instead they have to burn it? What does any of that have to do with the words of the Psalms? Psalm 96 says, "Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth." And there they were, changing that into, "Oh, sing to the Lord something familiar. Sing to him, those who know the words already. Sing to him, all you who have a license from the town council." True reformation, true renewal on any level. And one thing that we learned at the Reformation, and we learned before that, I hope, from Jesus, is that we have constantly to be open, constantly need to recognize our need for God's guidance, constantly to be aware that we ourselves, as sinners, may be wrong. Or, even if we're not wrong, we may have things we can learn. We do have things we can learn. True reformation, ongoing reformation, on any level, as people or as a people, has to reflect first and foremost loving God with all of our heart and with all of our soul and with all of our mind. A love that leads us to love others, our neighbors, as ourselves. And that includes even people whose music we can't stand. And if you want, I could probably draw up a long list of people and composers and folks like that whose church music is not from my perspective, worth bothering with. But sometimes somebody gets something out of it. And if that's the case, can I not have the grace to let them go ahead and sing the Lord a new song? And in fact, teach them one myself. I think I can. And not just in music. For we are God's people, the sheep of his fold. The Father